The contractor arrived an hour late, his heavy boots tracking clumps of mud across my late husband's favorite antique rug. I pointed to the mat by the door. "Excuse me," I said, my voice polite but firm. "Could you please wipe your boots?" He turned, a sneer twisting his lips. "You're lucky I even showed up, old lady." I ignored the insult and led him to the porch, my hand resting on the polished mahogany cane Arthur had carved for me. I started to explain the dry rot on the railing, leaning on the cane for balance. Suddenly, he snatched it from my grasp. The wood, so full of memories, felt heavy in his rough hand. He laughed, a short, barking sound, and tossed it onto the damp lawn. It landed near a muddy puddle, like a piece of trash. "You're too weak to complain anyway," he said. Then he turned his back on me to take a loud phone call, pacing my yard as if he owned it. My hands trembled, but not from weakness. It was a cold, sharp anger I hadn't felt in years. I watched him, my mind already working. "We'll see about that," I whispered to the empty doorway. That night, I sat down at my computer. My quiet investigation into who he really was had just begun. The invoice he'd left on my kitchen counter was smeared with grease, but the company name was just clear enough: Brick House Renovations. My fingers, stiff with arthritis, typed the letters into the search bar. The results loaded slowly, one by one. I felt a chill as I read the first review. "Total scam. Took my deposit and never came back." The second, "Overcharged my elderly mother. Work was terrible." The third, "Threatened me when I asked for a refund." My pulse quickened. These were not just unhappy customers. They were people like me. He didn't just target homeowners. He targeted the elderly, the vulnerable, the ones he thought wouldn't fight back. I wasn't just another client he'd disrespected. I was his next target. I scrolled for almost an hour, my tea growing cold beside me. He preyed on people he saw as weak. Then I found it. A short, terrified review from 8 months ago. It detailed threats and shoddy work. But it was the comment added 2 months later by the same user that made my blood run cold. Update: my garage mysteriously burned down. The inspector called it faulty wiring. I know it was him. My husband, Arthur, had been a judge. He taught me that every story has roots, and you just have to be patient enough to dig them up. It took me 2 days to find the woman who wrote the review about the fire. Her name was Agnes, and she was living in the Sunnyside retirement home just across town. I found her in the common room, knitting a small blue blanket. Her hands shook as I introduced myself and mentioned his name. Her voice cracked as she described how the same contractor, the one who tossed my cane, had threatened her when she asked for a refund on a retaining wall that collapsed. "He said he'd make the insurance handle it," she whispered, looking over her shoulder. "He said I was a crazy old woman and no one would believe me." I realized then, sitting on that floral couch, that he wasn't just a bully or a thief. He was a predator, and this was his pattern. He isolated his victims, humiliated them, and then, if they pushed back, he destroyed their property. He counted on us being too scared or too tired to fight. Before I left, Agnes gripped my wrist. Her fingers were bony but strong. She pressed a small, unlabeled USB drive into my hand. "I set up a security camera," she whispered. "You'll want to see what I recorded." When I returned home, I locked my front door and plugged the small USB drive into my laptop. My hands were shaking again, but this time with anticipation. A single video file popped up. I clicked it. The footage was grainy, clearly from a hidden camera angled at her driveway. It showed the contractor, the same man, his face red and twisted in rage. He was shouting at Agnes, who stood on her porch. I couldn't hear her words, but his were crystal clear, full of curses I hadn't heard since my teaching days. He accused her of lying about the payment. Then, in a fit of pure anger, he grabbed her porch light, a glass lantern, and ripped it right off the wall, throwing it onto the concrete where it shattered. He kicked a bag of tools across her yard before storming off. My lips tightened until they were a thin, white line. This is what he did to women who stood up to him. He used intimidation and violence. But this time, He'd picked the wrong woman. I had spent 40 years teaching history, teaching arrogant young men how to fear authority and respect the facts. I carefully saved the footage to 3 separate hard drives. I labeled one folder, Insurance Fraud, Phase 1. I went back to the invoices Agnes had given me and the ones I'd found photographed in the online reviews. I spread them across my dining room table. It felt just like grading final exams. My eyes, trained by 4 decades of catching plagiarized essays and sloppy research, scanned the documents for patterns. He was arrogant, and arrogant men always get lazy. I found it on the 3rd invoice. A signature supposedly from a city inspector, approving the work. I compared it to another. It was identical. Not just similar, but pixel-perfect identical. It wasn't a real signature. It was a digital stamp, a forgery. He wasn't just overcharging, he was faking safety inspections. I printed every invoice, every review, and every screenshot. I slid them into a heavy leather binder, the one I used to keep my lesson plans in. I set it beside my teacup, like an old friend. My years of grading papers had sharpened my eye for forgery. I knew exactly where to poke, exactly what pressure to apply, until a man's web of lies collapsed around him. I closed the binder. It was time to hire him again, but not as Eleanor Whitby. This time, I would hire him under a false name. I became Mrs. Alcott. I bought a cheap prepaid phone, the kind they sell at the drugstore. I set up a new email address. Using that new identity, I found a small, empty house for rent on Willow Street, a few miles away. I paid for 1 week, in cash, using my niece's name to sign the short-term lease. Then, as Mrs. Alcott, I called Brick House Renovations. I made my voice sound higher, more frail. I said I was a widow looking to sell my home, but the inspector said I needed some repairs done on the porch first. He took the bait immediately. When he arrived at the Willow Street house, he didn't even look at my face. He just saw the gray wig I'd bought, the oversized glasses, and the nervous way I held my hands. He saw another easy mark. "It's a lot of damage, ma'am," he said, kicking a perfectly fine support beam. "Structural. Very expensive." He grinned too widely, a shark smile. "But I'll cut you a deal, seeing as you're on your own." I smiled sweetly back, my hands clasped together. Oh, I love a man who's generous with his time. He didn't realize I had a hidden camera, no bigger than a button, tucked right into the pocket of my old coat. The footage I captured that day was gold. It was better than anything Agnes had recorded. As Mrs. Alcott, I asked him simple, innocent questions. "Oh my, are you sure the wood needs to be replaced? It looks so sturdy." He laughed at me. "Lady, I've been doing this for 20 years. This whole beam is rotten. See." He tapped it, but his lie was clear. He lied about the cost of materials, claiming prices had just doubled. He inflated the hours it would take. He even faked a phone call to a supplier, arguing loudly for a discount on my behalf. "See? I'm looking out for you," he said, hanging up. My calm, frail responses only baited him further. He wanted to impress me with his knowledge, to make me feel helpless and dependent on his expertise. He revealed his entire scam, from the fake material costs to the city permit fee that I knew went straight into his pocket. Every deceitful word, every arrogant smirk, every condescending pat on my shoulder was caught in high definition. That evening, I uploaded the new clip to my secure drive. I labeled the folder, Phase 2, Pattern of Deception. I learned something important about him during that meeting on Willow Street. His real weakness wasn't just money. It was his ego. He needed to be admired. He craved respect, but he also loved to be feared. He wanted to be seen as the tough, smart boss who had everything under control. So, as Mrs. Alcott, I started to praise him. I called him on the prepaid phone the next day. "Mr. Johnson," I said, using his last name, "I was so impressed with you. You're so professional. I'm going to recommend you to my rich friends from the city." I could almost hear his chest puff up through the phone. "Well, I appreciate that, Mrs. Alcott," he said, his voice suddenly smooth. "I like loyal clients. You tell your friends I'm the best." I told him my friends were very wealthy and had several properties. He became even more agreeable, promising to personally oversee my small job. He was so busy imagining the big money he was about to make that he didn't stop to think. He didn't wonder why a frail old woman knew so many rich friends. His pride had blinded him completely. That night, I sent him an email from a new account, pretending to be one of those friends. The new email I created was for Catherine Pierce, a wealthy investor. As Catherine, I wrote to him about a much larger job. I explained that I was managing an estate that had fallen into disrepair and needed a full restoration before it could be sold. I mentioned a fake budget of $2 million. I wrote that my dear friend Anna Alcott had recommended him as the only man for the job. He took the bait instantly. He replied within 10 minutes, his tone entirely different. He was professional, obsequious, and full of compliments. "Mrs. Pierce, I would be honored to handle this project personally," he bragged. "My team is the best in the business, and we can handle any restoration, no matter the scale." I had him. He was so blinded by greed and his own ego that he couldn't see the trap closing around him. He was too greedy to notice that the property address I gave him for the estate was one I'd known. At least, not yet. I smiled as I read his reply. I quietly arranged to rent the large, abandoned property on the edge of town for 1 week, again, using my niece's name. I staged the new house perfectly. It was a large, empty Victorian, much like my own but in far worse shape. It was perfect. I spent a morning making it look believably damaged. I found some old, cracked tiles in the shed and laid them on the kitchen floor. I loosened a decorative railing on the grand staircase. When he arrived, I greeted him in my new disguise. This time, I was Catherine's assistant. I wore a smart blazer, pulled my hair back tightly, and wore severe-looking glasses without a prescription. He didn't recognize me at all. He swaggered around the empty rooms, whistling. "Big job," he said, rubbing his hands together. "This place is a wreck. We'll have to gut the kitchen. All new plumbing." He was dictating prices and fake deadlines, his eyes gleaming. I just nodded, taking notes on a clipboard and recording every single second. He didn't notice the wireless microphone clipped to my blouse, nor the tiny camera lens in the button of my blazer. At the end of the tour, he handed me a thick contract. "For Mrs. Pierce," he said. "Standard." I smiled as I signed the assistant's name. My lawyer friend had already reviewed a blank copy. It was completely, beautifully invalid. My late husband, Arthur, had been a respected judge. His oldest friend, Arthur's brother from law school, was a man named Samuel. Samuel was retired now, but he still held a lot of influence in the city. More importantly, he still owed me a favor from when I'd helped his son with a history thesis. I called him. I hadn't spoken to him in months, and he was happy to hear my voice until I explained the situation. I told him everything, starting with my cane and ending with the invalid contract I'd just signed. There was a long silence on the line. Then, Samuel chuckled. It was a deep, rumbling sound. "Oh, Eleanor," he said, his voice full of admiration. "You haven't changed a bit. You always did your homework. You've built quite the case here, better than most first-year associates." I told him about the other victims, about Agnes and the fire. His tone hardened. He asked me to send him all the evidence, the videos, the forged invoices, the new contract. "I'll take care of this," he promised. He offered to file a quiet, anonymous report directly to the district attorney's office under the guise of anonymous community interest. The machine was starting to turn. Samuel's call had lit a new fire under me. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was focused. I went back to the forged city inspector signatures. I had a name, Mr. Peters. But I needed more. I dug deeper into the city's public records online. I looked up every permit brick house renovations had filed in the last 5 years. It was a tedious process. I cross-referenced the approval dates with city employee databases. I found that his construction permits weren't just sloppy, they were all fake. He'd been forging safety inspections for years, using a long-defunct city seal he had probably copied. I printed every single one. I sat at my dining table with a red pen, just as I had with my students' papers. I circled every mismatched signature, every incorrect date, every impossible approval. I compiled them all into my evidence Bible. Then I saw it. One of the names on a forged permit from last year wasn't Mr. Peters. It was a different name, one that matched a city employee who was still active. He had gotten sloppy. He had used a real name on one of his fakes. The next morning, I put on my best coat and drove to the city clerk's office. It smelled of old paper and stale coffee. I found the employee from the forged permit. He was a nervous-looking young man, probably in his late 20s, with glasses that kept sliding down his nose. I didn't approach him at his desk. I waited until he went on his break, following him to the small, sad vending machine area. I introduced myself as a concerned citizen. When I quietly mentioned the contractor's name, the color drained from his face. He nearly fainted. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered. I placed a comforting hand on his arm. You don't have to be afraid of him anymore. His eyes filled with tears. He told me to sign off on things, he whispered, his voice trembling. He said if I didn't, he'd tell my boss I was taking bribes, that I'd lose my job. I looked him straight in the eye. You won't, I said firmly. But he will. All I need is the truth. I asked him to write a detailed statement of every time he was threatened and every form he was forced to sign. He looked at me, took a deep breath, and nodded. He agreed. With the employee's sworn statement safely scanned and sent to Samuel, it was time for the next step. I called the contractor, back in my original voice as Eleanor Whitby. He sounded surprised to hear from me. What do you want? He grunted. I told him I had concerns about the porch railing he had inspected weeks ago. I said it felt wobbly. I invited him back to my house to look at it, hinting that I might pay for more work if he could reassure me. His greed won out. He arrived an hour later, his truck screeching to a halt. He was smug, dismissing my questions with a wave of his hand. It's fine, lady. You're just paranoid. He kicked the post hard. See? Solid. Just as he said that, an official city car pulled up to the curb behind his truck. A man in a crisp uniform stepped out, holding a clipboard. It was a real inspector, sent by Samuel's contact in the DA's office. The contractor's face drained of all color. He knew that uniform. I simply folded my hands, serene as tea steam, and watched the panic rise in his eyes. The inspector walked up the path. Brick house renovations? We're launching a full investigation into your company's permits. That night, my phone rang. It was him. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Hello, I said, my voice calm and steady. He didn't bother with greetings. Did you call the city on me? He barked, his voice loud and rough. What did you tell them? You're trying to ruin me. I stood by my window, looking out at the dark yard where he had thrown my cane. I simply asked a city employee to do his job. I replied, my tone icy. They seemed very interested in your paperwork. He exploded. You crazy old witch. You have no idea who you're messing with. I could sue you for harassment. I'll own this dump. The threats were empty now. He was a cornered animal, lashing out. That would be difficult, I said, my voice dropping. To sue me, you would have to find me, and Mrs. Alcott, and Catherine's assistant. There was a dead silence on the line. I could hear him breathing, fast and shallow. He knew. You'd have to find us first, I repeated softly. Then I hung up the phone. I took off the wig I'd worn as Catherine's assistant and set it on the table. I smiled. A moment later, an email popped up from Samuel. It contained only 4 words. He's being audited. Things began to move very quickly after that. The local news got wind of the city's investigation. A reporter must have connected the audit to the string of bad online reviews. The first headline read, Local contractor accused of scamming elderly homeowners. The story was vague at first, mentioning an ongoing investigation and multiple complaints. He, of course, denied everything. He went on social media, posting a rambling video from his truck. He called the claims fake news and lies from bitter clients who didn't want to pay. But his denial only opened the floodgates. His post was flooded with comments. Dozens of victims, people I hadn't even found, suddenly felt brave enough to speak. They posted photos of shoddy work. They uploaded screenshots of threatening text messages. They shared their own stories of being overcharged, bullied, and ignored. His wall of lies was crumbling, brick by brick, in public. Then, someone, I suspected it was Agnes's grandson, leaked the first video. The grainy footage of him screaming at Agnes and ripping her light from the wall. And right after, someone else leaked a new clip. It was short, only 10 seconds, filmed from a distance. It showed him at my house, snatching my cane and tossing it onto the lawn. The clip of him throwing my cane went viral within hours. It was the image that cut through all the noise. It wasn't just about bad business anymore. It was about cruelty. The internet exploded with a fury I had never witnessed. How could anyone treat an elderly woman like that? One comment read. He didn't just toss her cane, he tossed her dignity, said another. The video was shared on every platform. It was on the local news that night, playing on a loop behind the anchor. People I didn't even know were defending me, defending us. I stayed silent. I did not reveal it was me in the video. Not yet. My name was not important. The important thing was that he could not escape the image. He was no longer the tough boss. He was a bully who hurt old women. I wanted him to stew in that public shame. I wanted him to panic, to feel the walls closing in, to crumble completely before the final truth arrived. The pressure was building. Reporters, no longer satisfied with online comments, started camping out in front of his small, nondescript office building, their cameras waiting. He couldn't handle the pressure. The viral clip, combined with the audit and the swarm of reporters, made him snap. He stormed into his office, bypassing the news crews, and began screaming at his staff. He accused them of leaking information, of talking to the press, of stabbing him in the back. One of his employees, a young secretary he had apparently been bullying for months, secretly filmed his tirade on her phone. She recorded him shouting, sweeping papers off a desk, and threatening to fire everyone. She posted it online anonymously that afternoon. It was more evidence, more rage, more proof of his unstable character. That video was the final straw for his business partners. They issued a public statement announcing they were withdrawing all support. His investors, seeing the fraud investigation and the public relations nightmare, froze all his accounts. He was radioactive. Late that night, an anonymous, white envelope was slipped through my mail slot. I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, a draft of his company's bankruptcy notice. Someone on the inside wanted me to know. The machine of justice was moving, but I had one more piece to place. I thought back to Agnes and the fire. I thought about the other victims. I contacted one of his former clients, a man whose insurance claim for a new roof had been denied due to questionable work. The man had been forced to pay for the repairs twice. I met him for coffee. I didn't give him my name. I simply handed him a folder. Inside was all the evidence I had compiled on the forged permits and fake safety inspections. I showed him how the contractor's fraud was the direct reason his insurance claim was denied. The man's eyes, which had been dull with defeat, lit up with a cold anger I recognized. He took the folder, thanked me, and called his lawyer before we had even finished our coffee. Within days, the contractor, already drowning in debt and public shame, was hit with a massive civil lawsuit from the insurance company. They were suing him for fraud, and they had the evidence to prove it. Samuel told me he tried to flee the city, but it was too late. His accounts were frozen. He had nowhere to run. He finally showed up at my house. It was raining, and he looked like a drowned rat. He was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes wild with panic. He hammered on my door until I opened it, leaving the chain on. "You," he shouted, pointing a shaky finger at me. "You did this. You started all of it." His voice was no longer booming and confident. It was thin and cracked. "Please," he begged, his whole demeanor collapsing. "You have to call them off. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. I'll fix your porch for free. Please, I'll lose everything." I looked at him through the narrow opening, at this broken, pathetic man. I thought of my cane, lying in the mud. I thought of Agnes, terrified in her home. I looked down at my polished mahogany cane, resting securely in my hand, and then back at him. You already did, I said, my voice void of all emotion. I unhooked the chain and opened the door just enough to hand him a single, folded letter. It was not from me. It bore the official seal and signature of the city prosecutor's office. It was his formal summons to appear in court. He stared at the letter, his face turning an awful shade of gray. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He was completely and utterly beaten. He knew what the letter meant. He knew that I had not just complained, but that I had built a fortress of evidence against him. Just then, 2 police officers, whom Samuel had arranged to have nearby, pulled up to the curb. They had been alerted that he might become violent when served. They walked calmly up my path. I stayed silent as they approached him, read his rights, and informed him he was being arrested for felony fraud, elder abuse, and witness intimidation. He looked betrayed, cornered, and utterly powerless. It was the exact same feeling he had tried to inflict on me that day on my porch, the same helplessness he had counted on. As they led him in handcuffs to their car, he turned and screamed at me, his voice cracking with desperate rage. You'll regret this. You old hag. You'll regret this. I simply watched from my doorway, my hand on my cane, and felt nothing at all. The courtroom was quiet. I sat in the back row, wearing a simple gray dress. I did not want to be the center of attention. I was just a witness, one of many. The prosecutor laid out the case, piece by piece, using my evidence Bible as his guide. The footage played on a large screen for the judge and jury to see. First, the video of him snatching my cane and tossing it aside.
The courtroom gasped.
Then, the video of him screaming at Agnes, smashing her light. Then, the footage from the Mrs. Alcott's sting, where he calmly and arrogantly detailed his plan to defraud a frail old woman. The jury saw the forged permits, the identical fake signatures, the sworn statement from the terrified city clerk. Every lie he had ever told, every person he had bullied, it all unraveled in the harsh, public light of the courtroom. When he took the stand, he tried to lie, to charm, to blame his employees. But the evidence was too strong. He was a small man, trapped in a very large lie. After 2 days, the judge announced his sentence: 5 years in state prison for fraud, multiple counts of threats, and financial elder abuse. Months later, after the trials and the noise had faded, I received a letter. It was from the state prison. His name was on the return address. I opened it with a letter opener, my hand steady. The note inside was short, written in messy, angry-looking cursive. I thought about what you did for a long time. It read, I was wrong that day. You weren't weak at all. You were dangerous. I read the last word, dangerous, and a small smile touched my lips. I folded the letter and placed it on the mantelpiece, right beside Arthur's photograph. I looked at his kind, smiling face in the silver frame. He'd have liked that, I whispered. He always said the quietest people often had the most to say. The judge had ordered the contractor to pay restitution to all his victims, including me, from the sale of his seized assets. I had received a significant check from the settlement. I wasn't done yet. I had plans for that money, plans that would ensure what happened to me and Agnes would not happen to anyone else. The first thing I did was take my cane to a local craftsman, a young woman who specialized in restoring old wood. The contractor had thrown it, but it hadn't broken. It was just scratched and dented, the finish marred by the mud. The craftswoman treated it with reverence, especially after I told her my husband had carved it. When she returned it to me a week later, it was magnificent. She had sanded it down, restained the mahogany, and polished it until it gleamed like new, warm and smooth under my hand. When I held it, I felt Arthur's presence again. It felt steady, strong, and proud. It was a part of him and a part of me. A few days later, I received a phone call. It was from a local community action group. They had followed the trial. They asked if I would be willing to speak at a community event. The topic was protecting our seniors from fraud. I looked at my restored cane, resting against the wall. Yes, I said. I would be honored. Standing on that stage in the community center, I faced a packed hall. The room was filled with retirees, homeowners, and families. They were all here to learn, but I could see the fear in some of their eyes. They were afraid of being the next victim. I adjusted the microphone, my polished cane warm in my hand. I looked out at the crowd and began. A few months ago, I said, my voice clear and strong, a man came to my home and told me I was too weak to complain. The entire room leaned in, silent. He believed that our age is a weakness. He believed that living alone is a weakness. He believed that politeness is a weakness. I paused, letting my words sink in. He was wrong. Weakness doesn't come from age, and it doesn't come from a cane. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people watching me. It comes from silence. It comes from letting them believe they are strong when they are simply cruel. A woman in the front row started to clap, and then another, and soon the whole room was on its feet, the applause echoing around me. I lifted my cane, not as a crutch, but as a weapon of justice. And for the first time since Arthur's death, I didn't feel alone. I felt powerful.